Right before some of the largest military campaigns in history, something very strange often happens. Diplomats begin shaking hands, leaders hold press conferences, statements about peace and stability fill the headlines. For a brief moment, the world begins to believe that the crisis might be fading away, but then something unexpected happens. Behind the scenes, the machines of war begin to move. This pattern has appeared so many times throughout modern history that once you start noticing it, you begin to see it everywhere. Governments speak the language of diplomacy in public, while in private, an entirely different process unfolds. Meetings are being held, budgets are quietly approved, command structures are reorganized, operational plans are reviewed, and by the time the public finally realizes what is happening, the most important decisions have already been made. When people think about the military, they usually imagine a disciplined fighting force. They picture brilliant generals studying maps, soldiers preparing for battle, and commanders making difficult decisions about national survival. But the reality inside many modern military institutions is often far more complicated, because over the past several decades, many large militaries have slowly transformed into something else entirely. They have become bureaucracies. And like all bureaucracies, they begin to follow a very particular kind of logic. Most people hear the word bureaucracy and immediately think about paperwork, endless meetings, and complicated procedures. They imagine offices, committees, and administrators protecting their departments. And in many ways, that image is accurate, because once an institution becomes large enough, its primary goal often stops being victory. Its primary goal becomes survival. When that shift happens, the entire psychology of the organization begins to change. Instead of asking what is strategically necessary, people begin asking what is politically safe. Instead of asking what is true, they begin asking what their superiors want to hear. Slowly, almost invisibly, the culture inside the institution begins to evolve. Loyalty becomes more valuable than competence. Agreement becomes safer than criticism. And once that dynamic takes hold, something very unusual begins to happen. The organization starts to resemble something that looks surprisingly similar to a cult. That might sound like an extreme comparison, but if you examine the structure closely, the similarities become difficult to ignore. In many cults, there is a central authority figure. Beneath that figure exists a hierarchy of loyal followers. Unity is emphasized, obedience is rewarded, and perhaps most importantly, there is a powerful fear of exclusion. No one wants to be the person who is cast out. Now imagine a room filled with senior officers. These are individuals who have spent 30 or even 40 years climbing through the ranks. Their careers, reputations, and identities are deeply connected to the institution. Their pensions depend on it. Their social circles exist inside it. Their entire professional lives are built around it. Now imagine all of them being gathered together in one room. Why would leadership do that? In the modern world, communication can easily happen through secure emails, encrypted briefings, or private calls. But sometimes leaders intentionally bring everyone together physically. And there is a very specific reason for that. Human beings are extremely sensitive to social pressure. When individuals are isolated, they can think independently, they can disagree quietly, they can even resist certain ideas. But when people are placed together in the same environment, something powerful begins to happen. They start watching each other. They begin measuring their reactions against the reactions of the group. Slowly, they start sensing which opinions are safe and which opinions are dangerous. This psychological force is known as group conformity. And once it takes hold, the dynamic becomes incredibly difficult to break. If one respected general stands up and enthusiastically supports the leader's plan, others often follow quickly. Not necessarily because they fully agree, but because they understand the risk of standing alone. Inside bureaucratic systems, isolation can be fatal to a career. So a strange kind of competition begins to emerge. People start trying to demonstrate their loyalty. They show that they are more committed, more enthusiastic, more aligned with leadership than everyone else in the room. And once that competition begins, it feeds on itself. Honest debate slowly disappears. Independent thinking becomes dangerous. Ideological unity replaces critical analysis. This is why some observers have started describing certain bureaucratic institutions as cult-like, not because they are religious, but because they share many of the same psychological mechanisms. There is the leader, there is the inner circle, there are rituals of loyalty, and there is the constant fear of being excluded from the group. If you want a simple example of this kind of pressure, you can actually observe it in something as ordinary as a reality television show. Contestants gather in a room waiting to hear the decision of the person sitting at the head of the table. Everyone knows that someone will be eliminated. Everyone knows their future depends on that one moment. And in those moments, people behave very differently than they would if they were alone. They become cautious, strategic, careful. They begin performing loyalty. Now imagine that same dynamic operating inside a massive military bureaucracy. Thousands of officers, multiple layers of command, endless committees, briefings, and strategic reviews. Every promotion depends on approval from someone above you. Every statement is observed. Every decision is evaluated. Over time, people learn exactly what the system rewards. And what the system rewards is conformity. Not always because leaders demand it directly, but because bureaucratic structures naturally evolve in that direction. Those who challenge the system too aggressively often disappear from it. Those who adapt, align, and support the official narrative tend to rise through the ranks. After decades of this process, the institution begins producing a very specific type of leadership. Leaders who are extremely skilled at navigating bureaucracy. Leaders who understand committees and reports. Leaders who know how to signal loyalty while avoiding unnecessary risk. But this raises an important question. Is this the kind of leadership that wins wars? Because war is chaotic. War requires creativity. It requires independent thinking. Sometimes it even requires disobedience. Many of the most successful commanders in history were famous for ignoring orders when circumstances demanded it. They broke rules, and those decisions changed the course of history. But bureaucracies are not designed to produce rule breakers. They are designed to produce stability. And stability is not always the same thing as effectiveness. This is where the situation becomes truly complicated. Modern militaries require enormous administrative systems. They manage massive budgets, global logistics networks, and highly sophisticated technologies. Such complexity demands organization, but the very structures that make these systems manageable can also make them dangerously rigid. And once rigidity takes hold, institutions begin protecting themselves. Budgets must be maintained, departments must survive, careers must continue advancing. Gradually, the system develops its own internal logic. Policies defend themselves, strategies reinforce themselves. Decisions gain strength simply because the bureaucracy itself supports them. Once that process begins, challenging the system becomes incredibly risky, because doing so means risking everything an individual has spent decades building. And this does not mean that everyone inside the system secretly agrees with every decision. In fact, many individuals privately have serious doubts. But private doubts rarely become public resistance. And that is where the comparison to cult psychology becomes even clearer. In many cults, individuals suppress their doubts in order to remain part of the group. The fear of exclusion becomes stronger than the desire to speak openly. The same psychological forces appear again and again in large institutions around the world. When you begin to understand those forces, the behavior of powerful organizations starts to make much more sense. Decisions that seem irrational begin revealing their internal logic, not the logic of victory, but the logic of survival inside a system. And that may be the most unsettling realization of all, because it suggests that the forces shaping global events are not always the result of brilliant strategic plans created by masterminds behind closed doors. Sometimes they are simply the result of a system that has grown so large, so complex, and so self-protective that it begins moving forward almost automatically. No single person fully in control, no single decision entirely deliberate, just a machine driven by hierarchy, loyalty, and the quiet, ever-present fear of being the one person in the room who stands up and says no. And once that machine begins to move, stopping it can become almost impossible. But once that machine begins to move, stopping it becomes almost impossible. Because large institutions do not change direction quickly. They carry enormous momentum. Thousands of careers, billions of dollars, and entire national strategies are tied to the decisions already made. And when that much weight begins moving in one direction, very few people inside the system are willing to stand in front of it. History has shown this pattern many times. Before wars begin, there are always moments where someone could still stop the process. Someone could question the assumptions. Someone could slow things down. But those moments are often brief, and inside large bureaucracies, hesitation can look like weakness. Doubt can look like disloyalty. Asking difficult questions can look like obstruction, so instead of stopping the process, the system accelerates it. Reports begin confirming earlier reports. Analysts begin supporting the conclusions that leadership already expects. Committees review plans that were designed long before the meeting even began. Slowly, the illusion of consensus emerges. It begins to appear as though everyone agrees, but that agreement is often not the result of open debate. It is the result of pressure, incentives, and institutional momentum. Once that illusion of unity forms, the next stage becomes much easier. Resources begin to move. Ships are deployed, aircraft are repositioned, supply chains are activated, intelligence systems shift into wartime posture. To the outside world, these moves may look like preparation or deterrence, but inside the system, something very different is happening. The machinery is locking into place, and once the machinery of war locks into place, reversing course becomes extremely difficult, because by that point, too many people have committed themselves to the decision. Too many reputations are tied to the strategy. Too many careers depend on the plan succeeding. Backing down is no longer simply a strategic decision. It becomes a political risk. Admitting doubt can mean admitting failure, and institutions rarely admit failure easily. Instead, they push forward. Sometimes they push forward even when the situation has already begun to change, because once the system commits itself to a direction, it begins defending that direction. Information that supports the strategy rises to the top. Information that challenges it slowly disappears from the discussion. Not necessarily because anyone is deliberately hiding the truth, but because bureaucracies tend to filter reality in ways that protect themselves. This is one of the most dangerous dynamics inside large organizations. Reality becomes negotiable. Signals of warning become softened. Bad news becomes delayed. Critical analysis becomes politically inconvenient. And by the time the full picture finally becomes visible, events may already be in motion. This is why wars sometimes begin in ways that seem almost accidental. Not because leaders wanted catastrophe, but because systems moved forward step by step until turning back became impossible. Every stage seemed reasonable at the time. Every decision seemed justified by the information available. But together, those decisions created a chain reaction. And once that chain reaction begins, it becomes incredibly difficult to stop. That is why understanding institutions is so important, because the most powerful forces shaping the world are not always individual leaders. They are systems, systems of incentives, systems of hierarchy, systems of pressure and reward. And once those systems reach a certain size, they begin operating according to their own internal momentum. Sometimes even the people inside them struggle to control them, which leads to a deeply uncomfortable question. If the most powerful institutions on earth are guided not only by strategy, but also by bureaucracy, conformity, and institutional survival, then how many of the world's largest conflicts are truly the result of careful planning? And how many are simply the result of systems that became too large, too rigid, and too powerful to stop once they started moving? Because history suggests that once the machinery of war begins to turn, it rarely stops easily.